Hello. I wanted to take a few minutes and just provide you with a brief history of the field of communication studies, starting from its early roots in classical rhetoric with Plato and Aristotle to the contemporary field and what some of the hottest trends are right now, as well as give you an idea of the number of grads, the number of students in communication studies, and how the field is growing. Communication studies is a fascinating field because it really got its start way back in the classical Greek academy with Aristotle. Aristotle was a pupil of Plato, who was a pupil of Socrates, and of course Plato and Aristotle wrote a lot about different subjects, political theory, economic theory, and communication was one of them that Aristotle wrote about. And they often used Socrates in their dialogues. And so he was the teacher, and then he would be speaking to other people, and then they derived their lessons and insights from those dialogues. Well, Aristotle wrote a book called The Rhetoric, and he begins that study that tried to explore persuasion. How were people how did they become persuasive? And he defined rhetoric or persuasion as the study of all of the available means of persuasion. Rather, he defined rhetoric as all of the available means of persuasion. And he did that back in the early, 300 BCs. So you can see that the field of communication and people thinking about how to best communicate and how to achieve an outcome in communication has been happening for a really long time. In fact, rhetoric was then and was for thousands of years, or many hundreds of years at least, in the heart or at the center of the classical education. And many universities, when they first started to be developed, had a department of rhetoric and courses of rhetoric that were at the heart of a classical education. It wasn't until the early 1900s that you had a rebirth of rhetoric and rediscovering Aristotle. And so in the early 1900s, this neo-rhetorical school of thought emerged, and it happened in English departments. And there were courses in speech communication that started to be taught in English departments. And that was the heart or the beginning of the communication discipline. As these speech teachers started to teach these courses, and they were very popular, they formed conferences, they had associations of public speaking teachers, and eventually that group of public speaking teachers broke off and formed their own association and began their own departments of communication studies. As electronic media came into vogue and was being developed, you started to have an interest in media. And of course, the telephone being developed in the late 1860s, and radio, and then television, and then film first, and then television, and then of course on to the internet. The media aspects of communication became much more important, and so you had growing departments in that area in communication studies and growing majors. There was this movement in empiricism and positivism, this idea of behavioral effects related research. That happened between the 50s and 70s, and of course that affected communication departments as well, and specifically in the area of interpersonal communication. As we wanted to understand how people related and interacted, we began to adopt empirical methods to study these kinds of things. 1965 to 80, you have, again, another wave of rhetorical studies, and now it's taking on a critical bent, where they started looking back at how we have done things and used to do things, and they started critiquing that and coming up with new theories, and some of those theories will be looked at in our class. 1970, 1980 was really the tail end of that positivistic, behaviorist research trend, and you had a growing use of what we'll call universal models in communication studies. And you'll see this in one theory called anxiety uncertainty management, but there were a lot of theories that were trying to develop laws for how communication behavior happened. Like, we need to come up with these laws that everybody seems to follow and obey in how they communicate. And then another school of thought was the rules theories, and that was watching people and examining how they communicate and coming up with, discerning what are the rules that they seem to be using or creating as they're communicating. From the 1980s on to really now, you've had the growth of the interpretive research trends, and we'll talk a little bit about the difference between qualitative and quantitative research, but interpretive research tends to look at how people are creating meaning in their communication, not so much looking for laws and rules. So ethnographic studies, people going into communities and existing or residing in those communities for quite some time to try to see how they tick from the inside out. That's an ethnographic look at something. They focused on relationships. The intercultural field was born. Small group relationships and dynamics started to be researched. And then organizational communication was a new school or group of theories that were developed in that area in the 1980s and on. So beginning in the 1990s, because of, again, the development of the internet and a lot of digital technology, you had a lot more focus shift to technology-related communication. And today, in the early 21st century, you're seeing a lot more attention to neurobiological communication and research in that area, health communication, growth of critical theories and examining deconstructing and examining the way things were done in the past and critiquing them, and then research methods that don't just use either qualitative or quantitative, but use a mix. And so these mixed method studies are growing in popularity. There is a professional organization called the National Communication Association. Most communication scholars are at least familiar with that association, if not members. There's also an International Communication Association. There are lots of regional associations that kind of are subsidiaries of NCA. So the Eastern Communication, Central States, Southern States, Western States. The department at Bethel is very active in Central States Communication Association. There are lots of other associations that relate to other subdisciplines like technical communication or media communication. Broadcast Education Association is something that some of our department members are a part of that handle more on the media side. And then the Media Ecology Association, things like that. So there's a lot of academic organizations that are in the discipline and people active in those. And then within NCA, this is just a quick screenshot of some of the divisions in NCA, so you can see all of the sub-disciplines within the field of communication. There's a lot of them. So for instance, I'm a member of the Mass Comm division as well as the International Intercultural division, but with interests in lots of the others. Some of my colleagues in the department are members of the Family Communication or the Interpersonal division, the Health Comm division, things like that. So it's this NCA is a large membership network. I think there's 6,000 or 7,000 members of NCA. You can see on this slide that the NCA reports that there's 60,000 plus undergraduate communication majors across the nation, 6,000 plus grad students, over 1,200 universities that offer courses or degrees in communication. And then in terms of the percentage of the humanities majors, bachelor's degrees awarded in the humanities, Comm is the largest humanities major in the United States, with more than a quarter of grads coming from the discipline of communication studies. You can see 26.3% of all humanities degrees awarded in 2018 were from the field of communication studies. The field is one of the only humanities majors that is growing and has been growing since 1987. Many other humanities majors are on the decline, but communication studies continues to increase. And part of that is because of the broad workplace pathways that are out there. There's so many careers that communication studies majors can enter. So it becomes a very viable, marketable degree. So that's it for now. That's a really quick overview of and a little bit about the history of the discipline. We'll unpack some more of this in class. See you next time.